All right, welcome to lecture number 37. Today we're talking about the Mexican-American War. Our theme is America in the World, and our learning objective is to explain the causes and effects of the Mexican-American War. Now, before we begin with the regular key concepts, we're going to do a quick overview of the war because the key concept outline doesn't really focus on the progression of the war, though it is important and it makes more sense knowing how the war progressed, how it started, progressed, and ended. So, the cause of the war is over the annexation of Texas. Texas joins the United States, and the southern boundary of Texas was still disputed between Texas and Mexico after they gained independence. Mexico said that the boundary was a lot further north, giving Mexico more territory. Texas had said that the boundary was further south, down to the Rio Grande, giving Texas more territory. So the United States sends troops into the disputed territory, and there is bloodshed. Mexican troops kill American soldiers, and we go into war. A lot of people in politics, in American society, there are a lot of people who dissent against this war, who don't like it, they disagree with it. Abraham Lincoln, he was in the House of Representatives during this time period, and he introduces a spot resolution several times to try and determine whether American soldiers were actually in American soil when they were killed. So were they defending themselves, or were they actually in Mexican territory, or at the very least disputed Mexican territory when they were killed? Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist, Henry David Thoreau, the transcendentalist, and then Henry Clay, the leader of the Whigs, also opposed the war. Now, the United States Army easily took over the territories in Mexico and California. Those efforts were led by General Kearny and also General Fremont in Northern California. He will become more important as time goes on. He'll run for president for the Republican Party in 1856. In northern Mexico, we have General Zachary Taylor taking over that territory, or the modern day northern Mexico, and he's successful at the Battle of Buena Vista. General Zachary Taylor is going to gain a lot of fame from this, and then eventually going to run for president under the Whig Party. And he will be successful in 1848. And then finally, General Winfield Scott sails to Veracruz. It's a coastal city on the Gulf of Mexico. And then from there, they march to capture Mexico City, the capital of the country. So remember this amphibious attack, because Winfield Scott's going to be active in the Civil War, and he's going to be in charge of Civil War strategy. And he will try to use this in fighting against the Confederacy. And then finally, the outcome. When Mexico City is captured by Winfield Scott, the fighting ends in 1847, and the end of the war is negotiated with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it sets the terms for Mexico's border and the US border to be at the Rio Grande. So that's the current day, modern day border between Mexico and the United States. Additionally, all of the territory west of Texas, so California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, all of those are going to become US possessions, and the United States is going to pay Mexico $15 million for that territory. And they're also going to pay out any claims that Mexican citizens had against the US, which totaled around $3 million. So knowing all of that now, we can move forward and talk about the Mexican Cession. So the United States added large territories in the West through victory in the Mexican-American War and diplomatic negotiations, raising questions about the status of slavery, American Indians, and Mexicans in the newly acquired lands. The Mexican Cession is the territory of California, Nevada, Utah, New Mexico, Utah twice, Arizona, and parts of New Mexico. So you can see it there on the map. And the diplomatic negotiations include the annexation of Texas in 1845. The president at that time was John Tyler. He was watching the election of 1844 go on between James K. Polk and his expansionist policies that he wanted to implement. And so when John Tyler saw that Polk got elected president, he saw the writing on the wall, and so he beat Polk to the punch and annexed Texas before Polk came into office. Finally, when Polk does become president, he will sign the Oregon Treaty in 1846 with Great Britain, and in 1854, later on, the United States will purchase the Gadsden Purchase, which is this little sliver of land in Arizona or south of it, the southern portion of Arizona, for $10 million from Mexico in order to be able to build a transcontinental railroad line that goes through the south and reaches Southern California. There was already a northern route that was being planned that connected the Midwest to Northern California and San Francisco. All right, so the questions about slavery that came up because of this territory were made even more explosive with the Wilmot Proviso. So Southerners wanted to extend their institution of slavery into the newly won territories. They were still bound by the Missouri Compromise line of the 3630 parallel, but they wanted to continue and move outwards. Those who were in the north, who were free soilers, they wanted to keep slavery out of these new territories, which is what the Wilmot Proviso would have done. But it never passed Congress, though it was a hotly contested issue from the time in which the United States was fighting the Mexican-American War all the way to 1850, when we will see a compromise be made. The Southerners, while the war was going on, they wanted to have more of the Mexican territory be given to the United States because that would help them expand the institution of slavery. It would mean more lands to cultivate and more profit to be made. Whigs opposed the war on moral grounds, but there was a lot of split within the Whig Party because they were a national party. There were some Southern Whigs and there were Northern Whigs. And as you can see from the political cartoon on the bottom right, they were being led by two opposite forces. Clay on the right, who was in his old age at this point, and then Zachary Taylor, who's going to lead the Whig Party by 1848. Mexicans in the annexed territories, they had the opportunity to gain full U.S. citizenship as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, while American Indians were not given that same opportunity, and we'll talk about the treatment of both here in the next slide. So the U.S. government's interaction and conflict with Mexican Americans and American Indians increased in regions newly taken from American Indians in Mexico, altering these groups' economic self-sufficiency and culture. So let's talk about those who were Mexican or who were even further back of Spanish and Mexican descent. The Californios are a really good example of these groups. They were descendants of the Spanish and Mexicans in California. And by the time that the Mexican-American War ended, there were about 13,000 of them in California. They were usually the most influential people in that territory. They were landed, they were wealthy, but as more and more American settlers are coming in, they're starting to lose their influence. They did fight against the United States Army in the Battle of San Pascual, in which they actually got a victory over General Kearny right after the U.S. Army had finished crossing the Great Basin. As far as culture, from New Mexico to California, we still see remnants of Spanish and Mexican culture, especially in the architecture and the names of places. So you see the old churches, the mission systems, that Spanish architecture was still seen throughout. It's still seen in California and the Southwest today. As for California Indians, the new occupation of the Americans over California was detrimental to the Native American populations. From 1845 to 1877, the Native American population in California plummets from 150,000 to 30,000 Native Americans. State officials advocated for their removal. On the bottom right, you see a quote from the first governor of California, Peter Burnett, in his State of the State address. He says that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct. Must be expected. So the state of California, with the help of the federal government, pursued a policy of land dispossession and the use of reservations. They were removing Native Americans from their environment that they normally used to be self-sufficient, which led them to looting and stealing of crops or animals and livestock. The way in which the U.S. government dealt with it was by passing the 1850 Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. It sanctioned a legalized form of slavery for California Indians, those that were didn't have a job or a means of self-sufficiency would be hired out without pay. And finally, we have disproportionate violence. Like I said, they would be forced to loot or to steal livestock. And in those instances, the white settlers in California would make patrols, they would seek them out, and in many cases, these incidents would result in massacres. So the weapons and patrols were funded by the state and the federal government. All right, finally, the recap. The United States completed its goal of expanding to the Pacific by way of the Mexican-American War. Secondly, the new territory fanned the flames on the debate on the expansion of slavery. And then finally, Mexicans and Native Americans living in the newly acquired territory were affected differently by the American government. Mexicans were given an opportunity to be US citizens, while Native Americans were even more vulnerable under US rule. All right, so that is it for this lecture. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.